Bruce Springsteen was 3 verses into The River when he looked down from the stage and saw something that made him forget every word he had ever written. What happened in the next 4 minutes left 22,000 people completely silent and changed the way Springsteen performed that song for the rest of his life. It was October 3rd, 1980, at the Meadowlands Arena in East Rutherford, New Jersey. Springsteen was on the first leg of the River Tour, the most ambitious run of his career up to that point. He had released the album just 2 weeks earlier, and the crowds were hungry, not just for the music, but for the stories behind it. Because that was always the thing about Springsteen. People didn't just listen to his songs, they lived inside them. The arena was packed to its absolute limit, 22,000 people pressed together in the New Jersey night, and the energy was the kind that makes the floor shake, and the chest tighten, and the hair stand up on the back of your neck. Springsteen had already played for 2 hours. He'd torn through Badlands, Prove It All Night, and Darkness on the Edge of Town. Now the band had gone quiet. The lights had dimmed, and Bruce had walked to the edge of the stage alone, with just an acoustic guitar and a single spotlight following him. What none of those 22,000 people knew, what nobody in that building knew except for one man standing in the 14th row, was that the song Springsteen was about to sing had been written about that man's life. His exact life. His lost job. His pregnant wife. His slow, quiet devastation. The man had never told anyone. He had never written a letter. He had never tried to reach out. He had simply bought a ticket, driven 40 minutes from his house in Linden, New Jersey, and stood there in the crowd with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, waiting to hear what Bruce had done with the worst years of his life. His name was Ray Kowalski. He was 34 years old, and he had worked at the General Motors assembly plant in Linden for 11 years before it closed in 1979. Ray had been one of the last to leave. He remembered turning off the lights. When the plant closed, Ray lost more than a job. He lost the version of himself he had always believed he would be. He and his wife Carol had just found out she was pregnant with their first child. They had a mortgage on a small house on Jefferson Avenue. They had plans, modest ones, the kind that don't require much except for things to keep going the way they have always gone. Things did not keep going. Ray spent 14 months looking for work. He took whatever came. A month stocking shelves at a grocery warehouse. 3 weeks doing demolition on a building in Newark. A few odd jobs here and there that didn't add up to anything. Carol went back to work at the diner where she had waitressed before they got married. Their son Michael was born in the winter of 1979 into a house where the heat was sometimes on and sometimes wasn't. Ray wasn't a man who talked about things like this. He was the kind of man who got up early and stayed late and believed that if you just kept working, things would eventually sort themselves out. But some nights, after Carol and the baby were asleep, he would sit at the kitchen table with the radio on low and feel something that he didn't have a word for. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was closer to a kind of disbelief, a feeling that the life he had been promised, the one his father had lived, the one the whole town seemed to agree was available to any man willing to work for it, had been quietly canceled without anyone bothering to tell him. Then, in the summer of 1980, he heard The River on the radio for the first time. He was driving to a job interview when it came on. He pulled over to the side of the road on Route 1 and sat there with the engine running. By the time the song ended, he had been sitting there for 5 minutes, and he was gripping the steering wheel with both hands, and his eyes were dry. But something inside him had shifted in a way he couldn't explain. Someone had found the exact shape of what he felt and put it into a song, and now it was on the radio, and strangers were driving past him without knowing that he was hearing his own life played back to him. He did not get the job, but he bought the album the next day. By October, he had listened to it so many times that the grooves on the vinyl were beginning to wear. When his brother-in-law called with 2 extra tickets to the Meadowlands show, Ray didn't hesitate. Carol stayed home with Michael. Ray drove to the arena alone and stood in the 14th row with his arms crossed, the way he always stood when he was trying to hold something together. He had not told anyone why this particular show mattered to him. He would not have known how to begin. Springsteen opened the song the way he always did, with a few quiet words to the crowd first. A short story about growing up in New Jersey, about his father, about the gap between what you hoped for and what you got. Ray listened to those words and felt his throat tighten. Then the music started, simple and steady, like a heartbeat. By the second verse, Ray's arms had uncrossed. By the third verse, the verse about the river running dry, his vision had begun to blur in a way he hadn't anticipated and wasn't prepared for. That's when it happened. Springsteen, from the stage, stopped singing. Not because something went wrong, not because of any disturbance in the crowd. He stopped because he had looked down into the audience during the most devastating line in the song, the line about the river running dry. And he had seen a man in the 14th row who looked like he was trying not to come apart. Springsteen had played that song dozens of times in rehearsal and sound check, but he had never seen someone react to it like this. Not like this. Not with this particular combination of stillness and collapse that made it look like the man was a building that had just been quietly condemned from the inside. The band played on for 2 more bars, uncertain. Then Springsteen raised his hand and they stopped. The arena went quiet so fast it felt physical. Springsteen stood at the edge of the stage and looked out. "Hey," he said into the microphone. His voice was gentle. "You all right down there?" 22,000 people turned to look at Ray Kowalski. Ray looked up at the stage. He was not a man who cried in public. He was not a man who made scenes. He was the kind of man who had learned early that the world did not particularly care about your interior weather, and that the best thing you could do was keep it to yourself and keep moving. But he had been standing in this arena for 2 hours, listening to a man sing his life back to him. And now that man was looking directly at him from the stage and asking if he was all right. And Ray found that he did not have an answer that fit inside his chest anymore. "I worked at GM," Ray said. His voice came out louder than he expected. "In Linden, 11 years. They closed us down." The arena was so quiet you could hear the hum of the lights. Springsteen didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at Ray. Then he nodded, slowly, the way you nod when someone has said something that confirms what you already suspected about the weight of the world. "How long ago?" Springsteen asked. 79, Ray said. "Just over a year." Another pause. Then Springsteen said quietly into the microphone, "I wrote that song for you. I just didn't know your name." What happened next had never happened at a Springsteen concert before, and most people who were there that night would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe it accurately. Springsteen reached down from the stage. Ray was close enough that this was possible, and offered his hand. Security moved toward the stage, then stopped when Springsteen shook his head at them. Ray looked at the hand for a moment. Then he took it. Springsteen helped Ray Kowalski up onto the stage. He didn't hand him a guitar. He didn't ask him to sing. He didn't turn it into a performance. He just stood next to him, in front of 22,000 people, and started the song again from the beginning. Ray stood at the edge of the stage and looked out at the crowd. He said afterward that he had never felt anything like it. Not the size of the audience, not the lights, not even the music, though the music was everything. What he felt was that he was not standing there alone, that every person in that building was standing there with him, that the thing he had carried by himself in his kitchen at 2 a.m, the thing he had never had the words for, was being held up in front of 22,000 people, and they were all looking at it and recognizing it and not looking away. When the song ended, Ray walked back to his place in the 14th row. Nobody touched him. Nobody spoke to him. But the woman standing next to him, a stranger he had never met, quietly reached over and put her hand on his arm for just a moment. He never found out her name. After the show, one of Springsteen's crew members found Ray in the parking lot and brought him backstage. Springsteen was still drenched in sweat from the show. He shook Ray's hand and asked him his name, and asked about the plant, and asked about his family. They talked for 25 minutes. Ray told him about Carol, about Michael, about the kitchen table at 2 a.m. Springsteen listened to all of it without interrupting. Before Ray left, Springsteen said something to him that Ray would repeat for the rest of his life, though he always said he wasn't sure he had the words exactly right. What he remembered was this: the song isn't about giving up. It's about making sure nobody has to be alone with it. Ray Kowalski found steady work in the spring of 1981 at a smaller plant in Elizabeth. It wasn't what he had before. Nothing was ever quite what it had been before. But he went back to the Meadowlands every time Springsteen played there for the next 20 years, and he always stood in the same section, 14th row, arms crossed, waiting for the song. Springsteen never forgot him. In a 1987 interview, he spoke about the night without using Ray's name, describing it as the moment he understood what the song was actually for. "I thought I was writing about something I observed," he said. "That night I found out I was writing about something that was already happening to real people in real time. That changes everything about why you do it." Ray's son Michael, who was barely a year old the night his father stood on that stage, grew up hearing the story every few years, usually around the holidays when the family got together and someone would put The River on the record player. He never got tired of hearing it. When Michael was 19, he saved up for 6 months and bought his father tickets to the Meadowlands for his birthday. 14th row, center section, as close as he could get. Ray walked into that arena and stood in his section and waited for the song the way he always did. When it came, he stood very still. When it ended, he was quiet for a long time. Then he turned to his son and said, "He still plays it the same way." The General Motors plant in Linden was demolished in 1988. The lot sat empty for years. A shopping center was eventually built on the site. If you drive past it today, there is nothing to indicate what was there before. No plaque, no marker, no sign. But every time Bruce Springsteen plays The River, somewhere in the crowd, there is usually someone who looks the way Ray Kowalski looked that night in the 14th row. someone standing very still, someone holding something together that is trying very hard not to stay together. Springsteen always finds them. He has been finding them for 40 years, because that is what the song is for. Not for the stages and the lights and the arenas, for the person standing in the 14th row who drove 40 minutes alone and doesn't know how to explain why this particular night matters so much. For the person who pulled over on the side of Route 1 and sat there with the engine running and their hands on the wheel. For everyone who ever felt like the river ran dry and needed to know that someone else had noticed. There is something most people who love that song never knew about the night it was written. Springsteen has spoken about it only in fragments over the years, in interviews, and in his autobiography, in the occasional quiet moment between songs when he felt like telling the truth about where something came from. He wrote The River in 1979, during a period when he was spending long hours driving through the industrial towns of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Not for any particular reason, just driving, the way he always drove when he needed to think. He would stop at diners. He would talk to people. He would listen to what was happening in towns that had built themselves around plants and factories that were now, one by one, shutting down, quietly, without ceremony, leaving behind streets that looked the same as before, except that the men standing on them had nowhere to go in the morning. He was not trying to write a protest song. He was not making a political argument. He was trying to do something harder and simpler than either of those things. He was trying to find the exact feeling of what it meant to be someone for whom the American promise had been quietly and without explanation withdrawn. Not with violence, not with drama, just withdrawn, like a tide going out. The song almost didn't make the album. He recorded it, set it aside, came back to it, set it aside again. What finally changed his mind was playing an early version for his sister Virginia, who had married young, whose husband had lost work in the mid-70s, who had lived a version of the story the song was trying to tell. When it ended, she didn't say it was good. She said, "That's right. That's exactly right." He put it on the album. What Virginia heard in that room, and what Ray Kowalski heard on Route 1 with his hands gripping the wheel, was not a story about someone else's life. It was the specific, almost scientific accuracy of the emotional detail, the refusal to offer comfort, the willingness to sit in the dark and simply say, "I see this. You are not imagining it. You are not alone with it." Carol Kowalski was still awake when Ray got home that night, a little after midnight. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where he had sat alone so many times with the radio on low, and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I'm glad you went." Ray nodded. Then he said something he hadn't been able to say in a long time. He said, "Me too." Nothing about his life was different at midnight than it had been at 6 that evening. The plant was still closed. The money was still tight. The facts were all exactly the same. But something had shifted. The way things shift when you finally find the word for something you have been carrying without a name. The thing doesn't get lighter. You just carry it differently. That is what happened in the 14th row on October 3rd, 1980. Not with a grand gesture, not with a speech, with a song that told the truth, and a single moment of recognition from a stage in New Jersey that said, "I see you standing there. I know what you're holding. You don't have to hold it alone tonight." If this story moved you, Make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that their story matters. Have you ever heard a song that felt like it was written specifically for your life? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to ring the notification bell for more stories about the moments that remind us why music exists.